I'm delighted to speak today with Frank Sasinowski. So Frank, let's talk for a second about this conference, because I'm sure all of us attend a number of these scientific and medical conferences, and they tend to be kind of focused or so almost one-dimensional, if you will. What is it about this particular conference that makes it different, that makes it more valuable?
No, Max, so often you're right. Conferences are one-dimensional, that what happens is that, we're siloed. We talk to those people we know. And in fact, the internet, exacerbates that. So, having a conference like this brings us together, and it teaches us that we need to look across and have new ideas and reach out to those who can teach us other ways of knowing. In fact, the spiritual and the scientific are not dichotomous. They really, at their deepest levels, they converge. If I think that we are really one single community that divine love calls us to. And for instance, if you just look at the deepest levels of science and spirituality, you come to mystery. And whether it's trying to understand, quantum entanglement in physics, or you're trying to understand what is beyond this death, beyond this life, you come to the same mystery we brought together. And so that's why I'm so grateful to people like Monsignor Trafny and the Pontifical Council for Culture, the Cura Foundation, and the Science and Faith Foundation for bringing us together, because this allows us to understand new ways for us to go back to the place that we are called to, our vocation, with new insights, because we've been now brought to a different dimension. So thank you, Max.
So speaking of different dimensions and being called back to our particular skill set or strength, as it were, your background is really as in the law and in legislation and so forth. And people think of finding cures for rare diseases, for example, as something that is strictly the world of science and research. How is it that legislation can really help?
Yeah, it turns out when I was at FDA, President Reagan signed the Orphan Drug Act in 1983, and I was asked to help implement it, and we did that. And because of that effort, with this piece of legislation, this novel law, it spurred research. It spurred the investment community to look at rare diseases as a new opportunity, because there were now, through legislation, this new legislation, there were incentives that brought them forward to the rare disease community. And, we see that happen over and over again. I mean, I'll give you two examples. One is that I was asked to be part of the first panel of 5 people to testify before the piece of legislation that became the 21st Century Cures Act. And that law was a law that required, for instance, that the FDA record with every therapy it approves what was the experience of patients. Now, that might not sound like such a groundbreaking research idea, but our first drug laws that were enacted in the United States in 1906 through 2016, when Obama signed that law, never mentioned the word patient. We had fundamentally a paternalistic system that treated the patient, the most important person, the most important stakeholder in the whole enterprise. We treated them as an object for which something should be delivered, but not to have a voice in the process. And so we've changed that through legislation. And now the voice of the patient reverberates strongly throughout every part of research in the rare disease community. So it's another example of how legislation can stimulate research in profound new ways. The Congressional Bipartisan Caucus on Rare Diseases is introducing a new piece of legislation called the STATS Act. And that STATS Act will also, if it's enacted into law, will also spur new research in the rare disease community. So I know it sounds somewhat counterintuitive to think that lawyers preparing legislation are going to have an impact on propelling science forward to bring new targeted advanced therapies to the benefit of our sisters and brothers who are suffering with rare diseases, it causes you to pause. But the reality is they work together. It's just like you were talking about a moment ago about how science and spirituality work together. Same thing, legislation, lawyers, and science can work together too to bring forth good things for our community.
In a way, could you describe it as legislation could remove roadblocks, grease the wheels, and then make sure that the patient is at the center of everything we try to do?
Exactly. There was a time 20 years ago, the vice presidents of R&D for the pharma companies had a weekend retreat at a fancy resort. There were 3 people invited to be the speakers that weekend. It was Francis Collins from NIH, Janet Woodcock from FDA, and me. And my speech 20 years ago was to these vice presidents of R&D for pharma was to say, watch for the rising voice of the patient. You know, I could detect that we were at the inflection point at which we were going to start including the voice of the patient in this process. And it's all been good, Max. So yeah, we've made tremendous progress.
So Frank, we know that there are tremendous disparities in healthcare and healthcare outcomes and so forth. How do we help reduce those social disparities in the treatment, particularly of rare diseases? Because that's an even tougher nut to crack, if you will.
You know, often when I give speeches around the country, especially to medical schools, academics ask me that question all the time. They say, Frank, you're explaining to us how we do the research, how we get it through the regulatory process so that we bring new therapies to the benefit of patients, but how do you pay for them? And these can be very expensive, and especially there's social and disparities. Like you mentioned, I want to say this, that I work with hundreds of companies over the decades, you know, and I do not know of one company that has ever wanted to turn away even one patient with a rare disease from access to their therapy. No one has that intention. And yet there are, and now going back to law, there are occasions like anti-kickback laws in this country, and there are U.S. attorneys who prosecute those cases very vigorously, so that companies who have been trying to provide access by setting up funds in an independent, you know, kind of third party, so that a patient who needs access and doesn't have insurance or can't afford the copay, you know, will be able to access the medicine through accessing that. And those kind of anti-kickback lawsuits brought by U.S. attorneys, you know, have chilled kind of the access, but there have been new groups who have creatively worked around that. There's a group called the Assistance Fund, which is, I think, shielded from those kind of anti-kickback provisions, so that what I'm trying to say, and answer your question, I'm not saying it as well as I'd like, is that any patient who has a rare disease, who knows that they have a therapy for them, and yet they're having difficulty, don't give up. There is a way. There are places. Please reach out. Go to your chat rooms. I know you'll find your way to access that therapy. And that's the good news.
Frank, thank you so much for your insight and for your hard work. Please keep it up. Keep doing it.
I wanted to say one more thing, Max.
Sure.
And that is that I've been doing this for almost 40 years. And one thing that I've noticed when patients come to me is they say, you know, Frank, it took me 7 years, 10 years, 15 years to get diagnosed. And so I've been there speaking to the communities saying, look, the tendency is for our medical system to say, oh, well, you know what? You have just IBD, but on a scale of 1 to 10, yours is 15. Instead of pursuing and looking to see, they might have a rare inherited genetic disorder that they've never seen before. So what I want to say is, if you hear hoofbeats, don't assume it's a horse. It may be a zebra. And so I think that, you know, you want to think about that, and think that you might actually be looking, when you're looking at a rare disease, at a zebra. So just don't make any assumptions.